Today on Bottles and Bites Without Borders, we're talking bourbon in 2025. Can the boom come back? Is the bust inevitable? Or could we see an evolution in the world of bourbon? Talking this and more. Let's get into it.
Welcome to Bottles and Bites Without Borders, where every sip and every bite tell a story. Rob is your host. Each week, he will take you on a delicious journey, from vineyard tales and distillery secrets to culinary traditions. So, grab a favorite drink, a plate of something tasty, and join us for another adventure with Bottles and Bites.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for stopping in. And as you heard by the intro, we're going to talk bourbon in 2025. But I think before we can, get into the state of bourbon in 2025, we kind of need to talk, a little bit about how we got here. The world of bourbon has been in this bourbon craze for more than a decade. I'd say 12, 13 years since, 2013, 14, somewhere around there. And the boom of bourbon, it was driven by a combination of cultural, economic, and industry factors, that created this skyrocketing demand. And I want to talk about a few of those things. And this all, like I said, 12, 13 years ago. So we're looking at the mid-2010s when this really started to take some traction and really start to grow. And let's just go back even a little bit further and say bourbon, 80 years ago, 70 years ago, it's the American spirit, right? Everybody knows that today, but it was your granddad's drink of choice. It was your dad's drink of choice, depending on the, how old you are. Very popular drink. And then it went away, in the 70s and 80s. And what caused that, or a big part of causing that, was the introduction and love of the cocktail world of clear spirits, the gins and the vodkas. And it kind of took over for quite a bit, a couple decades. So when bourbon came back, part of it coming back was the craft cocktail renaissance, right? In the early to mid 2000s, there was this resurgence of classic cocktails. Bartenders were reviving the pre-prohibition era recipes, and these recipes heavily featured bourbon. Cocktails like old fashions, Manhattans, whiskey sours, things like this. So this led to this new interest or renewed interest in the spirit of bourbon. So that was part of it. Also, you had consumer interest in quality spirits. As you started to dive into the world of bourbon, you could see from these legacy distillers, they had some great products. They had some, in the bourbon world, what we love, some aged products that you could get. And at this time, the cost for these products were very, very reasonable. Some might even say very, very cheap, inexpensive. And then another thing that contributed to the resurgence of bourbon in the mid-2000s was the pop culture influence, right? We saw shows like Mad Men that glamorized whiskey drinking again. We saw movies. Everybody talks about John Wick and how you'd always see Blantons in, all of the different 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it was of John Wick. Blantons was always there. So this cultural shift made bourbon kind of trendy again, desirable, especially among us younger drinkers. I say us, I at that time I was in my mid 40s, early 40s. And so, I still was fairly young. And then I think, one of the other contributing things was the global demand, especially from the Asian Europe markets again, and some aged stock, the scarcity hype started where, because bourbon requires, a number of years to age the way they want it to get this profile, these flavors that you want, distilleries couldn't immediately increase supply to meet the demand that was starting. So they came up with these rare bottlings, right? These annual limited releases that they would do, collector's items. And what they did was they created a market by driving up hype that eventually led to this craze of everybody looking for these. And ultimately, it drove up the prices. I mean, ridiculously, to where you have secondary markets now where prices have gone through the roof. So these are some of the reasons that bourbon, became popular, and we've been in this over decade craze for the spirit. The last one I'll mention before we kind of jump back into 2025 is the legislative changes, and industry expansion. States loosened the restrictions on distilling and direct sales. This allowed distilleries to open, expand tourism, especially in places like Kentucky and the Bourbon Trail. This attracted a lot of visitors from further places than ever before, and it really gave a lot of visibility to the spirit of bourbon. And this kind of helped the growth as well. So, all right, let's jump back to 2025. We're going to start talking about what does bourbon look like today, and what do we think it's going to look like in the near future? Well, I think for today, bourbon in 2025, it depends on the lens that you're looking at it from. And what I mean by that is, how long have you been in the bourbon world? How long have you been in this bourbon craze of chasing, hunting, enjoying, and sharing the spirit that is bourbon? And the reason I say that is because you're going to see folks like me who have been in it, for over a decade in this craze, doing the hunting, looking for all these limited releases, paying these what have become extremely high prices for bourbons. And I think we have a little bit of fatigue, right? There's a little consumer fatigue. And there's a few reasons why that is. I think it's because, one, a lot of, there's shelf items, and you heard me talking about it a minute ago. A lot of distilleries have these limited releases or these rare items, these rare releases. And the rare bottlings and these limited releases, they just got to a point where you just can't find them. So that was part of the fatigue. The other one was the prices got so extremely high that you start to question, am I getting bang for my buck here? Is it worth me spending, $250, $280 on a bottle of Rickhouse from Wild Turkey for that bottling, for that offering? Or is there something on the shelf that I enjoy? Maybe not as much. It may not be as good, but it's not a difference of 5 times. You know what I mean? And that's part of the problem as well. And, I think the overhyped, overpriced bottles also kind of, when you dove into the world of bourbon like I did over the last 10 years, and I think this applies to a lot of drinkers, it kind of got us, with this overhyped bottlings, these overpriced bottlings. We enjoyed the spirit, and we started to go, well, what are some other spirits out there that I could possibly enjoy? And I think it drove us to maybe exploring the world of scotch or rum or tequila and mezcal. So I think those were a few things that you saw related to consumer fatigue. Now, you heard me say, it depends on the lens that you're looking at it from, because if you're somebody who's just gotten into bourbon, even a couple of years ago, you might have got into it and you're absolutely on that journey and trying to hunt and explore and find, and you're still kind of on the craze, if you will. But I think you're in a way better position, because I think the bourbon market is starting to correct itself. These younger people who are getting into bourbon are going to be in a better spot to find things. I think costs were already, I don't know that they're coming down, but they're stabilizing. I think they may come down. Products that, you heard me mention that you could never find, these rare bottlings or limited releases. And that category went from a couple to just a lot of them. I don't want to say hundreds, but a lot of bottlings that were put in that category where you'd never see them again, that used to be standard on the shelf. Now those are starting to be seen on the shelf again. So I think if you're a younger bourbon drinker getting into it from that perspective, the bourbon world could be a good spot for you right now. You could find some things and have access, and could be easier to get some things than it was for people who got into bourbon, 7 or 8 years ago. So again, it goes from the lens that you're looking at the world of bourbon from, and kind of where you are on your journey. So consumer fatigue, definitely a big reason, because there's so many of us who've been in it for so long. I also think the rising prices, I definitely think declining collector interest. Like I said, a lot of us man, most of us probably have more bottles of bourbon at our house than most bars in whatever city you live in. And I would also say 90% of the bottles we have in our house are 100% better than the inventory at those said bars. No doubt about it. But I think bourbon, once had a speculative market similar to sneakers and luxury watches, but many collectors now, man, they're pulling back. They're just like, I've got enough bottles. And unless it's something, that I just have never had or been able to get, they don't really buy as much anymore. And I would say to that point, it used to be we would go out, we call it in the bourbon world hunting. We would go hunt for these bottles. We don't do that anymore. I'll buy a bottle if I'm happen to be in a store or whatever, and somebody has something, or I see it on the shelf and haven't had it, or whatever. Then I'll go ahead and pick it up, or if somebody offers it to me. But I'm not out hunting and looking and waiting in line for the release of an Eagle Rare or a Antique 107 or anything like that, where 8-10 years ago, I absolutely was. So I think the collecting part of it, again, you look at your inventory, you look at your collection at home, and you go, I've got 350 bottles of bourbon. I mean, it's going to take a while to drink all of those. So I think that's the interest from the collectors, I think, is going down quite a bit. So, the next thing I'm going to talk about could be looked at as a positive for the consumer, but definitely a negative for the producer, right? And that's supply chain and barrel shortages. If we think about the world of bourbon, and we talked about this, this bourbon craze for the last decade, bourbon has to be aged for a number of years, for a lot of years. And these distilleries are, they're doing their analysis, right? They're forecasting on what they think they're going to need for sales in the next, few years. And a lot of these distilleries have invested in expansion projects. Obviously the biggest one that comes to mind is Buffalo Trace. And these huge expansion projects are going to ramp up production, right? They're going to do that based on the past demand. But now with slowing sales, there's a risk of oversupply, right? And then we also have barrel shortages and increased costs for these new raw materials. Not new, but these raw materials when you're buying trying to make new barrels and things like that. Also for the grains, that you need, the corn, the barley, the wheat, glass, to put the liquid in once it's done. So all of these things are also, when we talk about supply chain and barrel shortages and how that part of the equation affects what we all get, it's part of the equation for sure. And then, as I said a moment ago, I think, one of the other areas that you have to mention is the rise of other whiskey categories, and maybe not just whiskey. Spirit categories might be more accurate to say. But one whiskey category I will mention is the American single malt. This is a whiskey that's really gaining a lot of traction as a premium alternative to bourbon. And, when you think single malt whiskey, think Scotch, right? I think takes some time for the bourbon drinker to finally, I don't want to say develop your palate, but get your palate to a point where you start to appreciate and enjoy Scotch. But once there, it's just another rabbit hole that you can go down. So for sure. And then I think, the international market, you can get, different whiskeys from places like Japan or Ireland or India, places like this. And then I think, other spirits. When we talk about rums that are fantastic, we talk about tequila is growing and becoming more popular, as well as mezcal. So these are all things that have contributed to where we are today in 2025, where we've seen these last 2 years of overall sales reduced by a couple percentage points. One of the other things I do want to mention is, when we talked about, and let's just say this, Europe and Asia has been a huge supporter of bourbon, even through that period you heard me describe when the clear spirits, gin and vodka kind of took over in the bars and the cocktail scene. Europe and Asia still supported bourbon. They bought from Wild Turkey and Four Roses and other distilleries very, very loyally. But when the boom came, over the last decade, that market, the international market, also saw massive growth. But, when you go to 2025, we see these economic challenges around the globe, and it's impacted exports, especially in the key markets for bourbon, like, Europe and China, Japan, places like that. Now, one of the other things that I think we're seeing, we talked about how the cocktail made the bourbon a little less popular, right, with the gin and vodka. And then we talked about how the cocktail brought bourbon back to kind of front and center with bringing back the classic cocktails. I think we're seeing the cocktail world have an impact here again. And what I mean by that, cocktails in general, I think are becoming more and more popular. They really are. And I think what's happening here, I think classic bourbon cocktails are still very, very popular, especially the old-fashioned Manhattan. These remain very, very popular. But I think a lot of bartenders, a lot of bars are trying to experiment more. And maybe they're doing that with gin or with agave spirits or even with rums and things like that. So I think, the world of cocktails, the how popular cocktails have become in this, creative kind of side of how cool can you make things in a bar and things like that. I think that's a big part of it as well. I also think, when you think about bourbon, it's very high proofed, right? For the most part, it can be as low as 80 proof, but if you're going to talk about, most bourbon, I guess if you're going to get it, Jack Daniels or something, old number 7 black label in the bar, it might be 80, 86, whatever it is. But for the most part, when a bourbon drinker is at a bar and he's ordering or she's ordering a neat bourbon, it's probably a product that's no less than probably, in very low side, 90 proof. And that would be, I would say 20% of the time. I would say, 80% of the time it's going to be 100 or more proof. And I'm saying all that to say we're in this world now. We've had all this kind of reporting and feedback on how alcohol affects people. And there's this kind of push to have less alcohol in our life. A lot of people are doing no alcohol in their life. Won't ever be me. So they're looking for lower proofed options, and some of those are cocktails, right? Anytime you can dilute that down, the bourbon, then you're getting less alcohol because you're watering it down. The proof is going down. So I think that's a big part of it too, that people are looking for less alcohol. So my conclusion here, I don't think bourbon's going away. We've been on this 10-year craze. Everything has to peak, but I don't think we're going to go down. I think we're more leveling out in the world of bourbon. I really do. And I want to talk about a few things. I think a lot of, the bourbon drinkers who have been into it for a while have come to the same conclusion that I have. And when we start talking about, one, the number of bottles we already have, two, there's so many, great bottlings that just sit on the shelf that are at a very reasonable price. And we know these, we've known of these, and now we're starting to say, hold on a second, I can appreciate this on a more regular basis than always having to look for something, unique or rare or thought to be special. So I think that's a big part of it, of why we're seeing this slowdown in the craze of it. I also think for a long time, there was this, just a crazy growth of craft distilleries in the United States, not just Kentucky. I don't think there's that many in Kentucky. But when you look at every other state in the United States, the rise of craft distilleries that were popping up here in Texas, we've got tons of them. And for a period of time, these were cool, right? Everybody wanted to try something new and different. The problem comes with longevity. And what I mean by that is, to continue to support and, back and enjoy the spirits from these craft distilleries, it costs you some money. And when you look at the craft distillery versus these, legacy brands like, Jim Beam and Four Roses, Jack Daniels, Wild Turkey, all these kind of things, when you look at you compare the craft distilleries versus them, quality-wise, I'm still going to give the nod to the legacy distilleries, maybe not by a lot, but I think over a more consistently throughout their portfolio, all of their products are going to be at a better quality than all of the products from a craft distiller. I think a craft distiller could get, a couple of really good products, but they may have an equal number of some you go, not very good. It's all right, that kind of thing. But the bigger difference is in 2025 is, we all have been dealing with inflation and all, and prices and things like that. So cost for buying a craft distillery product, you're anywhere entry level, maybe $50 up to, a couple $100. And when you look at the legacy brands, first one that comes to mind is Wild Turkey 101. Buy that for $19 all day long. There's from the legacy distilleries, Heaven Hill, Jim Beam, Jack Daniels, Four Roses. You can get all kinds of products from these distilleries that are sub $40 that are absolutely fantastic. So I think that's a big hurdle that the bourbon world, I think a lot of the loss of sales, maybe, and I don't know this for a fact, I haven't looked into it, but maybe a lot of craft distilleries that, popped the bubble and have closed their doors and there's no more production. So no more production means no more sales. And that could be part of it. It may not be the whole reason, but I'm sure it's part of it. One of the things I think the bourbon distillers are one of the challenges they're facing is, what's going to be the product that we have on the shelf. And what I mean by that is in the bourbon world, age statement's a very big thing. That's an identifier for a lot of us onto kind of, not totally, but kind of the quality of what we're going to get in the bottle, right? There's this, I think a lot of us in the bourbon world think there's this sweet spot. If you're anywhere between 6 and 10 years old, as far as the age statement of your bourbon, should be really good, has the potential to be really, really good. Younger than that, you're hit or miss. And obviously, as you go older, it should get, this more depth of flavor and depth of characters that are going on in the bourbon. So you assume it's going to get better. There is a law of diminishing returns, and it can be different for each bourbon drinker. For me, it's kind of at that 15-year mark. Anything, past that most times gets a little too oaky for me. But 6 to 10 years is that sweet spot for bourbon. So that's part of the dilemma for the bourbon distilleries now is, can you make enough bourbon and get it barreled and the time to get on the shelf to be able to meet the demand of the consumer? And I think that's part of the correction that we're seeing. Because sales are going down, I think we're seeing this correction of purchasing going down, which I think is going to help distilleries not be in such a rush to get product into the glass and on a shelf, which means we should get better product in the glass and on the shelf. Because we there for a while were heading down a path where I thought the bourbon that we would see, if the craze continued like it had up into 2023, if we stayed on that trajectory, I had conversations with friends that are big into bourbon where we thought what you were going to see on the shelf most of the time was going to be a 3 to 5 year bourbon, because they were just going to be, barreling it, and they couldn't wait any longer than that to be able to keep up with what the demand was. So I think this correction is going to help the bourbon distillers kind of take a breath, if you will, kind of step back and go, okay, we have been on this 100-mile-an-hour kind of pedal to the metal for the last 10 years. And it's probably nice for them to take a little bit of a breath, step back a little bit, and kind of reassess what their approach and how they're going to, make and release their bourbons. I think that's going to be something that they do that the consumers are going to benefit from. We're going to start seeing, and again, we are starting to see a lot of what used to be hard to find bottles on the shelf now. One of the things I think you might see more of too, for people to try things and maybe make a particular bourbon go a bit further. Most bottlings are 750 milliliters. I think you may start seeing this trend of 375 milliliters, right? Cutting that bottle in half. I think this could appeal to those who are still, really wanting to explore and kind of on this journey of what bourbon is and what are the different expressions I can get in the world of bourbon. And it also kind of hits a little bit with those who might be on a budget when we talk about inflation going on and cost consciousness of consumers. If you're going to cut the bottle in half, obviously we're going to cut that cost down. And that could be a way for people to buy bottles of bourbon, more bottles of bourbon, but in that smaller format, which I think is kind of cool. I really like that idea. I've heard more and more distillers talking about. There's been some legislation that's passed that's going to allow them to bottle in different ways and different sizes. Could be a 500 milliliter, things like that. So I think that could be part of the solution. And let's be honest, when you get into the world of bourbon and you're this bourbon hound, if you will, there's still, when something new comes out, even if it's not the liquid in the bottle, but it's the bottle itself, that still drives interest. That drives people back to go, I at least want a bottle of that to put on my shelf if you're a collector or something. So you might not be buying as much, but things like that can get you to go out and get something. I think about, an example of that would be Four Roses. Four Roses has their single barrel offering. And for the longest time, as long as I've been in bourbon, it's always been OBSV. That's the recipe. And those of you that don't know Four Roses, they have 10 different recipes. But in their small batch and their small batch select, you blend those recipes to get those offerings. If you pick a barrel, then you could get one of the other recipes on its own. Well, what they've done recently is they've decided to release some other recipes in a single barrel format, also at 100 proof, which is what the single barrel is at 100 proof. It's not barrel proof. So it's the same bottle shape. It's got the embossed rose on the front and everything, but it's got a whole different label. It's got the neck wrap at the top with the recipe that offering is, and it's really cool. And to be honest with you, if I find a couple, I'm going to buy a couple, but because it's a unique offering. But I think doing things like that, subtle things, are going to keep people interested in bourbon. And the reason I bring up the Four Roses and I say it's going to keep people interested in bourbon, because even some of you listening today may not have known that there's 10 different mash bills, 10 different recipes at Four Roses. And a lot of people have never had a private barrel pick, so they haven't on its own been able to experience or taste one of those other recipes. And so Four Roses coming out going, okay, there's been this craze of bourbon, and for whatever reason, they made the decision that we're going to start releasing some of the other recipes in a single barrel format. I think, and I've said it to a lot of my friends that have never had a single barrel pick, and these are some buddies in Missouri, that, when these hit, you need to go try them. And I think it's going to be that way for a lot of people. There's going to be this interest to go, even though this isn't new from Four Roses, these recipes have been being used in the bourbons that they produce. as a standalone, it's brand new. So it's something unique and different. It's a way for us who enjoy bourbon to kind of see what else, Four Roses has in the portfolio that they're using to make their bourbon. So I think from that aspect, it's going to be pretty cool too, to kind of keep, these are things that distilleries can do that aren't major. I think the list price on these bottles, the retail price is like $50, $55. So reasonable. And I think they're going to be, pretty much readily accessible, throughout the continent of the United States. So I think things like that distilleries can do, and it's going to keep people very much interested in the world of bourbon and keep them purchasing, some new bourbons and things like that. Now, another thing I want to talk about, and you heard it at the intro when I talked about, what might be the evolution of bourbon. And what I mean by evolution in the world of bourbon is, will it take a page out of the Scotch playbook? Will it start experimenting more with different finishes, different barrel finishes, like sherry or rum, ports, maybe some, wines from Napa, Cabernets and Merlots. And will they start doing this in a broader way? And the reason I'm kind of saying, will they, is because, as defined, by law now, if you do this to a bourbon, air quotes here, it's no longer a bourbon. It's now in America called a finished whiskey. So now we're starting to talk about how important is it to call it bourbon versus how important is it to have something really good in the bottle. Scotch doesn't have that issue. They finish, 90% of what they do, 95 probably, in some type of finishing barrel. They use used bourbon barrels. But in the world of bourbon, in order to be called bourbon, it has to be finished in new oak barrels. Doesn't have to be American oak, but it has to be new oak barrels. And if you start finishing it in something else, then it's no longer bourbon, it's American whiskey. And I don't know how that's going to affect kind of the distilleries. I will tell you that the bourbon drinker, at least the ones that I've talked to and that we've shared, bourbons that have been finished in a sherry, a rum, a port, a wine, we absolutely love them. And so I think it's something that, works really well. But isn't done a whole lot. I think a lot of it being because they want to keep their product as a bourbon. So I don't know where the give might be on that. Could it be that, legally they change the requirements that, if it's finished in something else, it can still be called bourbon, but it would be bourbon finished in whatever. Or maybe, the distilleries just say, hey, we need to make product that's popular for our consumers and they like this. So we're just going to make it for them. And maybe that's the direction it goes. Now, if I had a suggestion that I could make for the bourbon world to kind of keep bourbon, relative in the world of, consuming alcohol, in the world of spirits, in the world of, cocktails and everything. My suggestion would be strengthening the mid-tier market, that middle-priced bourbon tier that's $30 to $60. That segment really needs more focus. Many releases that come out, it's like you have this bottom shelf bourbon that's $20 or less, or you kind of get up to this 80 plus, a lot of times $100+ per bottle is the release. And we've talked about it a lot of times on this podcast with, friends and guests that that $30 to $60 range, there's just not a lot from a lot of the legacy distilleries, right? And I think they can really do a better job of that. And I think they can do a better job of, in that price range, having something with a good age statement on it. And, age statement, again, for the people who enjoy bourbon, it's an indicator. It's something they look for. It's something that could be a trigger to buy that offering if they've never had it, seeing the age statement on it, because it sets an expectation of what you're going to get in the bottle. So, well-crafted bourbons in that $30, $60 price range with good age statements. And I'm talking, if we're talking 8, let's just call it, I would say 9, 10, 11, and 12-year-old bourbon, somewhere in that range, 9 to 12, I think would be a range that, you would sell a lot of bourbon in that price point with that age statement. I can think of one right off the top of my head, a 9-year-old bourbon from Knob Creek, which is Jim Beam, a wonderful bourbon. It's I want to say it's 100 proof, 9 years, cost you $35, and it's delicious. I mean, you cannot beat that bourbon. If you could find it, Eagle Rare is a 10-year-old bourbon that sells for $40. 12-year-old Weller, I know I'm throwing some hard to find ones out there, but we're hoping with, increased production and decreased sales that some of these things might show up on shelves again. But just another example of an aged bourbon that can have a really good price. So Weller 12, the black label, is, $40 for a 12-year-old bourbon. Now, my only knock on that one is it's 90 proof. I wish it were closer to 100. And by the way, just jumping back to Eagle Rare real quick, I've heard that soon they're going to be releasing a 12-year 100 proof bourbon. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard that in multiple kind of groups and things. And again, it could just be a bad rumor, but it could be, either half accurate or somewhat accurate, or it could be completely accurate. Some people have pushed back. Why 100 proof? Why not 101? Because, it used to be 101 proof and the 17-year is 101 proof. But regardless, if there's a 12-year Eagle Rare that's coming out, that will also, create some hype and people will be looking for it. That is one that I would look for because that would be a unique offering. It would be a fun experience to, do a blind with it or just, taste and compare it to the 90 proof 10-year that we have, out on the shelves that we can get right now. One of the other things I think the bourbon community can do, not do, but maybe expand on, I think they do a really good job right now, is the tourism, specifically Kentucky. To me, I'm a wine guy too. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail, that's the Napa Valley of bourbon. That's where people go if you want this really cool experience in this kind of, jumping into the pool of history, if you will, of culture, of icons that are there, like Jimmy Russell, that are making bourbons. That's the Napa Valley of bourbon, the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, going over to Louisville in that area. So I think if they could expand and create some new experiences and, I'm not a marketing guy. I'm trying to think of what they could do, but I'll leave that to the professionals. But I think if they could draw some new people in that might not be hardcore bourbon people, I think the experience there, I see that a lot. And I keep referring to it as the Napa of Kentucky because I see that a lot in Napa. I see people go to Napa for the first time, not really wine drinkers, wine lovers. They'll dabble a little bit, and that might be what you get in the bourbon world. But when they leave Napa, a lot of times they're members at, 5 different wineries, and they've got these club shipments coming now, every 3 months. And so all of a sudden over the course of the year, they're spending a few $1,000s getting, 60 bottles of wine that are being shipped to them over the course of the year from these different wineries in Napa. And all of a sudden it creates this interest and love of wine, and they start to explore the world of wine, and it gets them on that journey. And I think the world of bourbon, it's doing it now, but I'd like to see them expand on it a little bit more, market it a little bit more. You really don't see a lot of marketing for Kentucky and the Bourbon Trail. I don't even know that a lot of Americans would know this were there if you weren't in the world of bourbon. So I think that could be really good. And I'll also say this. Look, I've been to to the Bourbon Trail to Kentucky a few times. It's always been with a group of guys or guys and ladies, but we're there specifically to pick some barrels for a store or something like that. And I absolutely love the overall experience that you get. You know, obviously, picking barrels is awesome, but I'm just talking about hanging out in Kentucky, going to the different distilleries, going to the different awesome restaurants, the downtown shopping experiences, the bars with cocktails and things. So my point in saying that is, the bourbon gets you there. But once I've been there, I've told my wife, hey, look, I know you're not a big bourbon drinker, but we need to go. We need to take you there. And I think she would absolutely love the experience of hanging out for several days, doing the little tours and different things, experiencing the communities, the history, the people, and, enjoying the food and the sights and everything that you can do that is the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. So I think, getting people there will then get them into the spirit a little bit more and help keep the bourbon world going. I think the other thing the bourbon world could do, taking a page from the wine world, is they could do things like exclusive tastings. They could, a lot of wineries will travel the country, maybe the world, but for sure the country, and they do tastings of their portfolio. And a lot of times those tastings include, these high-end bottles of wine that they have in their portfolio that aren't easy to try or easy to get, but they're going to do these tastings where you get this opportunity. And I think exclusive tastings in the world of bourbon could be a great thing as well. I think, blending workshops could be a lot of fun. I remember when we picked a barrel over at Maker's Mark, we did a private select barrel where you have these different staves that you're blending and putting these different profiles together to pick what you like, your recipe. That was one of my favorite things to do on one of our trips to Kentucky. It absolutely was a blast to kind of have that science project and do that. And then I think, when you pick a barrel, you get a more behind the scenes kind of tour of what's happening in the bourbon making world of a distillery and the rick houses and different things. I think if they, would open that up a little bit more where the average consumer who signed up for a tour would get to see those kind of things, I think that would help as well. And then, growing that bourbon experience, I'm talking about Kentucky, growing it out of Kentucky. Maybe Kentucky doing some pop-up things around the country. But I think there's some great bourbon places. Texas, where I'm at, is one of them that have some really cool distilleries. But I haven't seen any kind of a coordinated effort to promote the bourbons of Texas or the distilleries of Texas. A lot of them aren't just bourbon. They're single malts and things like that. So I think, getting that outside of Kentucky where we grow the appreciation for bourbon in the other states that, and like I said earlier on, all the states are producing bourbon now. So it's everywhere. So doing something that can attract new audiences, I think would be really, really good. And I'm going to say the last thing I think the bourbon community or the bourbon distilleries need to do to kind of help with keeping people interested is balancing the hype with the accessibility of a lot of these bourbons. Limited releases are exciting, but overdoing them can create consumer fatigue. And it has, for me and other people, because you're starting to see, because of the hype and where it's been the last decade, all the distilleries started making bourbons that are starting at $200 plus for the bottle of bourbon. So it's really, and again, we're in a capitalist market, so I don't blame the distillery if they're going to make it and price it at that, and people are buying it. That's no fault of theirs. The market dictates what people will pay for it. If they're not buying it, they're going to lower the price, and that's just not happening. So, but I will say that I think making special releases more available, maybe better lottery systems. I know a lot of distilleries have some lottery systems. I know stores don't do a good job of making it available to more of the consumers that buy there. And I think if they did that, rather than, fueling the secondary market, it would keep fans, I think, more engaged and maybe more loyal to their brands. And then I think they can create more single barrel or store pick programs. I know before COVID, the store picks were, really doing well, but obviously through those COVID years, you couldn't go to the distillery and do those. And it just feels like, post COVID, the store picks that we used to get and see, we're just not getting anymore. We're not seeing anymore. And that's kind of disappointing, because I think when we talk about special releases or limited bottlings, those are really, really hard to find. And that's, it is what it is. Store picks kind of fill that gap, right? It's a special pick, a special release, not specifically from the distillery, but from a group or a store that went out there with some people and made that selection. And so that's a really cool program that I think the distilleries need to really promote and grow at the distilleries for these for the consumer. Doing these pick programs, and it really allows people like me, the bourbon nerds, to find unique bottles, without the crazy markups on these bottles. So I think getting that back into it, and it's an experience, if you're able to be part of a group that can get invited to go pick a barrel, there's no other experience like it. I mean, that's something it will be a memory. And if you have a bourbon bucket list, I mean, and that should be on it. If you have a bourbon bucket list, checking that off, that's quite a feeling, because it's absolutely an experience to go to Kentucky and pick some barrels of bourbon. So I'm going to wrap it up by some final thoughts here. Is there sustainable growth still in the world of bourbon? I think there is. I think they've just got to get away from, the last several years of how they've been growing and booming. That's not sustainable. I think they can come up with, different approaches to continuing to grow the consumer base that loves this spirit that is bourbon. I definitely think they can. I think the bourbon industry needs to shift from this era of just rapid expansion and hype-driven releases to kind of a more balanced approach, focused more on quality, accessibility. I think that's the big one. People want to be able to get things. And then, a little bit of an innovation, being kind of creative in what you're doing. Everybody likes that a little bit. Don't overdo it, but a little bit. And then, making bourbon appealing to both, the consumers you already have, the loyal drinkers of the bourbon, and then doing it in a way that you get new drinkers to come in. The industry can maintain momentum without oversaturating the market. And that's kind of the balance that they need to figure out. So that's going to wrap it up for the episode today on bourbon in 2025. I think bourbon's going to be fine. I think the corrective course, it's just having to take because of, the consumer kind of drives that. I think it's necessary, and I think it's good for everybody involved, but especially the consumer. I think this is going to be a good thing for getting more people into bourbon. Hopefully bourbon will adjust the way they're doing things, and it'll be a more accessible, more quality products on the shelf for us to enjoy and keep us in the world of bourbon. So that's it for today's episode, everybody. Thanks so much for listening. Really appreciate it, and can't wait to see you on the next one.